My name is Sqn Ldr Rana Chhina, and I'm the Secretary of the USI Center for Military History and Conflict Studies. Now, today I'll be talking about the evolution of the system of honors and awards in the Indian Armed Forces. Although I must begin with a caveat. When we say system, it implies that someone somewhere knows exactly what is going on and how things are functioning and panning out. This, unfortunately, is a misnomer. And apart from a very narrow bureaucratic awareness of systemic procedures, there is no agency today that has an idea of the history, logic or rationale behind the customs and traditions governing the award of various honors, medals and decorations in existence. This is in a holistic sense. Now, an honors system is the means that is devised by a state of marking merit or exceptional service to the state by its citizens or soldiers. All societies and cultures have devised ways and means of recognizing merit and acknowledging the service of citizens towards the state. One of the more tangible and universal forms of such recognition is the institution of awarding medals and decorations in recognition of extraordinary services rendered. The forms may vary, and indeed by themselves these systems tell us as much about the political and social philosophy of the societies that devised them at any given point. A brief insight into the history and development of the system of honors and awards in India is useful to a greater understanding not only of the Indian honors system but also of the larger global picture, because as we shall see, many of the practices that are widely followed in many countries around the world today have their origins in Indian military usage. So to begin, we'll take a step back into history to the period of the British Raj. The British Empire in India was supported by the twin pillars of the ICS, that's the Indian Civil Service and the Indian Army. In my talk, I'll focus on the manner in which the system of honors and awards developed in the latter institution during the 2 centuries of the British Raj. And there's much to be gained from a closer examination of the form and substance of this system, since it provides us with tangible evidence of both the manner in which the British viewed their Indian empire, as well as the manner in which they wished themselves to be viewed. So at the outset, I'd wish to emphasize the basic point that as the empire developed, British perceptions of their role and position in India changed. And this change was accompanied by the advancement of theories of racial difference and superiority and extended to the Indian military in terms of the martial races theory, which limited the number of social groups that were allowed to embrace the profession of arms under the Raj. It's important to understand that a public honors system serves a number of functions in any complex social grouping, including the military. It binds both the donor and the recipient by reinforcing an underlying hierarchy, and it provides legitimacy to the political system structure that it supports. Moreover, the form of the honors of any country say as much about the institutions that create and bestow them as the society that receives them. Now, one of the recurring problems faced by the British in respect of their Indian army was the question of providing the Indian sepoy with an evocative, motivational appeal. The recourse to nationalism, which is open to a national army, was obviously out of the question. Hence, the British utilized the sepoy by building upon his traditional pride in the profession of arms and evoking the symbolism of Naam, Namak or Nishan, which is professional honor, fidelity to his salt and to the colors, as the underlying honor code of the Indian military. This precept shaped the ethos of the British Indian Army. It provided the basis of the regimental system, and the system of military honors was structured around it as a guarantor of fidelity to the Raj. This was reinforced by officially nurtured class or tribal identities that served as much to unify the military at a micro level as to divide Indian society at the macro level. The honor system was used to provide the cement to bind together this complex and varied mosaic into one symbolic whole. Here, in this illustration, you can see the colors of a pre-mutiny Bengal infantry regiment being blessed by a Brahmin priest circa 1843. The regimental system was the cornerstone of the British Indian Army, and through its medium imperial identities were both reinforced and disseminated across a widely diverse and varied socio-economic spectrum. In the late 18th century, the British were consolidating their position in India. They still derived their political legitimacy from treaties and concessions, which were extracted from various indigenous rulers, who in turn owed nominal suzerainty to the Mughal emperor in Delhi. As a result, much of the form and substance of early military honours adopted gradually, which was used by the British in India, was patterned on prevailing Mughal conventions, which were overlaid subsequently in due course by contemporary European modes. Indian officers and soldiers in the service of the British were initially honoured in much the same manner as those in the service of the Indian Nawabs or Rajas. And these distinctions were not formally institutionalized and took the form of mansabs or titles, khillats or robes of honor, jagirs, land grants, and assignments of land revenue. One such instance is the reward bestowed upon Subedar Major Mir Nuruddin, who was an aide-de-camp to successive commanders-in-chief of the Madras Army, for a meritorious and distinguished career spanning 60 years from 1780 to 1840. Mir Nuruddin was granted a hereditary jagir and rewarded with a palki or a palanquin along with an allowance for its support. He was also given the honor of the Naubat, a drum, in addition to receiving the titles of Khan Bahadur, Shuja Jang, accompanied by a magnificent gold medal studded with diamonds and other precious stones. However, this pattern of rewards, which drew heavily on the indigenous Persian Mughal style, was soon to change. As the company rapidly expanded its dominions and became increasingly confident of its political identity, it also sought to bring about a concomitant pacification of the subcontinent. This in turn led to changes in the traditional Indian military labor market, as the new employers of Hindustan constituted their Indian army on the European pattern. And the resultant change in military honours that was now taking place in India was to subsequently set the pattern for military awards, not just in Britain, but also in many parts of the world. Now, in May 1766, a group of European troops stationed at Monghyr in Bengal mutinied over an issue of pay and allowances. 2 Indian regiments under Robert Clive marched from Calcutta and were successful in suppressing this mutiny. As a result, the Indian forces that were involved were given a special medal to be worn suspended by a cord around the neck. And although often ignored, the Monghyr Mutiny Medal set the precedence for the award of special medals to commemorate campaign service to be worn by all Indian ranks engaged in the campaign or battle. A total of 9 distinct campaign medals of this pattern, covering service in the Deccan and Mysore to Egypt, Java, Nepal, and the Indian Ocean, were awarded to Indian troops before 1820. Now, the 3 decades that later follow the First Anglo-Burmese War of 1824 see a plethora of medals being awarded to commemorate service in places as far afield as Afghanistan, China, Sindh, Gwalior, and the Punjab. There was a growing sense, prompted no doubt by a desire for economy, that this proliferation of awards or rewards must be curbed, and the disastrous First Afghan War of 1841-42, it actually resulted in the institution of no less than 7 different medals, each rewarding service for a separate battle. When this pattern is later replicated with the annexation of Sindh and in Gwalior in 1843, which resulted in the award of 3 and 2 medals each, it was obvious that something needed to be done. Meanwhile, in what was to become standard practice henceforth, the effigy of the sovereign, symbolic of the font of honor, appeared for the first time on the medal awarded by the imperial government to Indian troops for service in the First Opium War of 1840-42. Another innovation which was introduced by Sir Charles Napier in the Sindh campaign in 1843 was the practice of naming other ranks in dispatches for gallant and distinguished conduct in the field. Hitherto, only officers had been considered worthy of such a mention. This then was the beginning of the MID, or mention in dispatches, today denoted by the wearing of an oak leaf on the appropriate campaign medal. And this was the first time in the world that an MID or mentions in dispatches were introduced, which are now followed by many armies around the world. The medal awarded for the first Sikh war in 1845 ushered in a pattern that was to become the standard for military medals in both India and Britain, and subsequently the Commonwealth. A single campaign medal, each named with the recipient's name, rank and regiment, accompanied by the addition of separate clasps to denote participation in individual battles. I'd like to mention here that the clasps were worn only on the original, on the main medal. They are not to be indicated on the ribbons, because as you will see as we go on, some of the medals were awarded with as many as 23 different clasps. So the current practice of sticking miniature medal clasps on the ribbons in undress uniform is both baseless and incorrect. The annexation of the Punjab effectively completed the British conquest of India, symbolized by the acquisition of the fabled Kohinoor, or Mountain of Light diamond, which became literally Britain's jewel in the crown. The Punjab Medal of 1849 has the distinction of having one of perhaps most striking designs to appear on a British medal. The reverse shows Major General Gilbert mounted on horseback, receiving the surrender of the defeated Sikh Sardars who are piling their arms at his feet. Behind him, drawn up in line, is a regiment of Bengal infantry, soon to vanish forever in the great conflagration of 1857. The Anglo-Sikh Wars were amongst the most hard-fought battles by the British in their quest for empire, and caused considerable consternation among the Sepoy army at the time. It is of no small coincidence that the imagery used to show the subjugation of the warlike Sikh state was so strong. However, it's not until 1854 that the most significant development on the prevailing pattern took place. And this was the introduction of a General Service Medal for campaign service, which was to become a permanent fixture of the army in India, and one that continues to this day. The India General Service, or the IGS Medal 1854, with its familiar red ribbon with two blue stripes, was to become the hallmark of two generations of seasoned Victorian soldiers. And during the 41 years that the medal was in existence, it was issued with no less than 23 clasps covering campaigns ranging from Persia, the northwest frontier, to Burma, and the northeast frontier, of course. Meanwhile, the devil's wind that blew across the subcontinent in the summer of 1857 and led to the demise of John Company and its replacement by direct rule of the British Crown merited its own medal. Here we see the Bailey Gate of the Residency at Lucknow, along with the Mutiny Medal with the Defence of Lucknow clasp. The siege and defence of the Lucknow Residency was an event that was to become deeply embedded in the imperial consciousness. It was the only place in the British Empire where the Union Jack was never hauled down at dusk, but flew day and night from the ruined battlements. However, not all the defenders of the Residency were British. The Bailey Guard picket, which is shown here, was held by loyal Indian sepoys throughout the famous siege. These loyal defenders were afterwards banded together into the newly raised Regiment of Lucknow, which carried as its badge a depiction of the Bailey Gate shown on the top of the slide. From now onwards, campaign medals largely follow the similar pattern, although exceptions to the General Service Medals were made for service in Afghanistan 1880, Egypt 1882-84, Africa, China 1900, Tibet 1903-4, and both the World Wars, which had their own specific different campaign medals. We now leave the subject of campaign awards with a look at the India General Service Medal 1895 to 1902, issued at the high noon of the British Empire in 1895. The first two of its 7 clasps were awarded to those who took part in the famous defence and relief of Chitral, an event that excited much interest at the time in much the same manner that the defense of Lucknow had done a generation earlier. The reverse of the medal depicts a British soldier and an Indian Sawar proudly supporting the same standard, invoking images of an imperial solidarity that was soon to come under strain from nascent political stirrings in the first decade of the new century. The India General Service Medal did not die out with the IGS 1895 but continued to be awarded later with the IGS 1908, which was issued with 12 clasps, and the IGS 1936. And after independence, as the General Service Medal 1947, which has been issued with 7 clasps, and the Samanya Seva Medal, which is still in current use, although most people nowadays have forgotten that it is actually a de facto campaign award. However, campaign medals were not the only means used for recognizing service to the Sarkar in the first quarter of the 18th century. As the Indian Army took to the field in areas far removed from its recruiting base, new challenges arose. Sociological and organizational changes, combined with a widening gulf between European and Indian officers, to produce administrative problems of social recognition and career advancement for Indian soldiers. Fewer positions of responsibility were now available to Indians of ambition and ability, even while the need to secure their loyalty loomed as an increasingly pressing concern. To address this, in 1834, the Governor-General Lord William Bentinck advanced 2 propositions for, I quote, the encouragement and reward of different descriptions of merit in the native army, unquote. To this end, he proposed the creation of 2 orders, the first for rewarding long, faithful and distinguished service, and the second for distinguished bravery in the field. The Order of British India, or OBI, was awarded to senior Indian officers and was modelled on the British Order of the Bath in 2 classes, combined with a generous financial allowance and the title of Sardar Bahadur or Bahadur in the first and the second class. The badge of the order was in gold, and it was worn around the neck by a crimson ribbon. The other of Bentinck's proposals, the Order of Merit, took for its inspiration the Russian Order of St. George and was awarded in 3 progressive classes for successive acts of conspicuous gallantry in action. A gold badge of the first class is shown in the slide. It's not often realized that the IOM, as it came to be known, was the oldest instituted gallantry award. It was considered to be the Indian equivalent to the VC or the Victoria Cross until that award became available to Indian troops in 1911, when the IOM was now reduced from 3 to 2 classes. A civil division of the IOM, for which soldiers were also eligible, was created in 1902 for rewarding acts of bravery in non-operational situations. Like the Victoria Cross, the IOM was uniquely democratic, being awarded to Indian officers and other ranks alike. It is also the only other decoration that could be awarded posthumously. Recipients were also eligible to an allowance equivalent to 1/3 their pay at the time of award. The standard of gallantry required for admission to the IOM was jealously guarded and remained of a very high order throughout. Till 1911, the process was accompanied by a stringent court of inquiry that established the legitimacy of the claims. The only time these high standards actually are relaxed happens during the Indian Mutiny of 1857-59, or the Great Uprising as it's called, when selected officers were authorized to make direct admissions into the order of merit. Given the immense jolt that the rebellion had caused in the imperial psyche, this is not altogether surprising. Members of the Order of British India and the Order of Merit were also exempt from ordinary discharge without pension on the reduction or disbandment of the corps to which they belonged. Now, the IOM, however, could not adequately cover the various contingencies peculiar to the Indian Army, and in 1907, the Commander-in-Chief Lord Kitchener prevailed upon government to press for the institution of a medal that could be awarded at the discretion of the CNC, or the Commander-in-Chief in India, for acts of gallant and distinguished service performed by soldiers in India. And accordingly, the Indian Distinguished Service Medal, or IDSM, was instituted in that year. So therefore, together with the OBI, the IOM and the IDSM, was one of 3 uniquely Indian military awards without parallel in the rest of the British Empire. As such, they emphasized the racial divide upon which the administration of the Indian Empire was based. And it's of interest to note that while considering the design of the IDSM, the Viceroy, Lord Minto, had insisted that the crowned effigy of the king appear on the obverse, as he considered this to be more appropriate for native troops as against the approved bareheaded image of the sovereign then being used on all war medals. The other medals in the toolbox of the Raj were the Meritorious and Long Service Medals, also known as by British soldiers as Roti Gongs or Roti Gongs, because they were supposed to come with the rations. And in 1888, these medals for long service and good conduct, as well as meritorious service, were instituted for Indian other ranks, so that, quote, the recipient may be held up as an object of respect and admiration to all ranks of the regiment, unquote. Another area which was used for advancing honor was the Dirbar. And in 1877, Queen Victoria was proclaimed the Empress of India, and 1 soldier from each regiment received the special medal commemorating the event. This set the pattern for subsequent issue of special medals officially commemorating royal jubilees and coronations, as well as the 2 imperial assemblages which were held in Delhi in 1903 and 1911. The slide shows the 2 Delhi Darbar medals superimposed on a photograph of the 1911 Delhi Darbar. The coronation grounds are still exist to the north of Delhi, near the to the east of the Mall Road, actually. Apart from the award of the medal to selected soldiers and officials, each such occasion was accompanied by a special honors list announcing a host of other distinguished service awards. Now, these imperial jamborees served to play out the ornamental spectacle of empire in all its pomp and glory. On the occasion of the Delhi Darbar in 1903, which was celebrating the accession of King Edward VII as Emperor of India, it was proclaimed that henceforth 6 specially selected Indian officers were to be annually appointed for special duty as orderly officers in attendance upon the sovereign in London. Known as the King's Indian Orderly Officers, during their tenure they wore their regimental full dress with a special aguilet, and the photograph that you see shows the first batch of 1903. Now, while the system of allocating land as a reward for distinguished military service was not new in India, it was formalized by about 1900, when 9 annual grants were made to special selected Indian officers, or VCOs, on the active list or on retirement. Such grants were accompanied by the title of Bahadur, if the recipient was not already a member of the Order of British India, and which also, of course, carried a similar title. However, the largest scale of land grants to Indian soldiers, including Indian other ranks, took place in the aftermath of the First World War, when 420,000 acres in the newly established canal colonies of the Punjab were generously distributed for meritorious and distinguished services during the war to ex-servicemen. Another form of rewarding war service that sprang up with the World War I was the Jangi Inam, or war reward. This took the form of a certificate attesting to a cash allowance to the recipient for 2 lives, that is his own and that of his nearest heir. The reward was replicated during the Second World War, although no rewards were made for the intervening years. Here we see a certificate awarded to an Indian officer for the First World War. Now, as you are all aware, the First World War was the harbinger of enormous social and political change insofar as our subject relating to the Indian military was concerned. It brought about a gradual Indianization of the officer corps. This in turn led to the extension of hitherto British honours being extended to Indian soldiers. It also brought in the class-based distinctions of the British system, leading to separate awards for officers and men. Thus, Indian soldiers could now also be awarded the newly instituted Military Cross and the Order of the British Empire. A further step was the extension of the Military Medal to Indian other ranks during World War II in 1944, with an accompanying revamp of the entire system of Indian Gallantry Awards. Now, prior to World War I, Indians were not eligible for the King's Commission, Indian officers being granted a Viceroy's Commission instead, and their employability was restricted to subordinate regimental positions. The system of honorary King's Commissions was institutionalized at the end of the war, when 200 such commissions were granted to selected senior Viceroy's commissioned officers, or VCOs, and these commissions were considered a great honor among the classes that enlisted into the Indian Army and were therefore greatly prized. The academic study of any sociological subject is incomplete without a reference to the actual people that form its constituent elements. As far as the British Indian Army is concerned, while we know a lot about the people who devised the systems and bestowed the honors, we don't know very much about the faceless people who received them. So I'd like to actually now cover some of the recipients of these awards to contextualize some of those nameless native soldiers that contributed so much to the legacy of the Indian Armed Forces as it exists today. Here we see a group photograph of the surviving men of the 14th Sikhs, which later became the 1st Battalion, the Sikh Regiment, and is today 4 Mech. These men had served in the defense of Chitral in 1895. Now, as natives, they were not very important in the imperial metropolitan scheme of things beyond their exotic appeal. Even their names are not recorded. Studying them in order to derive a better understanding of their motives and perceptions from a metropolitan perch therefore becomes a very difficult task. Now, while this could form the subject of a separate study in itself, I've selected quite at random illustrations of a few Indian soldiers, both distinguished and ordinary, in order to better illustrate the human face of honor. This photograph from 1903 shows a Nihang Singh, a militant sect of the Sikhs that maintain the traditions of the Khalsa soldiery of yore. However, this Nihang was also an old soldier who had served in the elite Queen's Own Corps of Guides Infantry, and on his chest he proudly wears the badges of his military service along with his ascetic turban as a testimony of the esteem that he held these awards in. This slide shows an oil painting dated 1852 of a Hindustani Musalman Risaldar of the 2nd Irregular Cavalry, raised in 1809 by Lieutenant Colonel William Linnaeus Gardner. The regiment was one of the few Bengal regiments to survive the mutiny of 1857, later becoming the 2nd Lancers, or the 2nd Royal Lancers, Gardner's Horse, which still exists in the Indian Army today. He wears around his neck the gold insignia of the 2nd class of the Order of British India, while his medals show that he served at the capture of Ghazni in 1837, in the First Afghan War 1841-42, and with the Army of the Punjab in 1848-49. The subject of this photograph is Ganda Singh, a Mohel or Brahmin Sikh enlisted in the 4th Punjab Cavalry in 1852. During the Great Uprising, he rode with the newly raised 1st Sikh Cavalry, and during the final capture of Lucknow, he saved the life of Sir Robert Sandeman, who was then a subaltern in the regiment. When Fane's horse was being raised for service in China, in 1860 he volunteered to accompany the regiment and was instrumental in saving the life of Sir Charles MacGregor near Peking or Beijing. He was awarded the Order of British India in 1888 and later appointed as Indian ADC to the Sqn Lord Roberts in 1889, retiring as an honorary captain with a small Jagir in 1895. Now, Ganda Singh named his new estate on the outskirts of Amritsar Robertabad out of affection for his old chief. However, that name did not sit well on rustic Punjabi tongues, and it is known to this day as Ganda Singh Wala after its founder. In this photograph, Ganda Singh wears the Order of British India, followed by 2 Indian Orders of Merit. He was actually awarded this only once, but perhaps he felt he deserved 2. We don't know why he's wearing 2. The Mutiny Medal with a clasp for Lucknow, China 1860, with clasps for Taku forts in Peking 1860, the IGS 1854 with the clasp Northwest Frontier, and the 2nd Afghan War Medal without a clasp. Now, the 1882 campaign in Egypt, it aroused tremendous enthusiasm in England. An army of 40,000 men had been engaged, drawn from garrisons in Malta, Cyprus, Gibraltar, and England, together with a contingent from India, the latter consisting of a cavalry and an infantry brigade. The services of the Indian troops engaged in the campaign were well rewarded. 5 regiments were honoured with the appointment of royal colonels. The Battle Honours Egypt 1882 and Tel el-Kabir were awarded to all the regiments. Campaign medals were authorised, and representatives from each regiment were ordered to proceed to England to be presented to the Queen. This is the first occasion that Indian soldiers visited England. In a departure from normal procedure, each of the 13 VCOs who accompanied the contingent were admitted to the Order of British India in honour of the occasion. This slide shows a chromolithograph depicting the Indian contingent in England. And the third figure from the left depicts Subedar Gurdat Singh of the 7th Duke of Connaught's Own Bengal Infantry, Abais Rajput of district Unnao in Awadh. Gurdat Singh was the eldest son of Subedar Hanuman Singh, IOM, late of the 33rd Regiment Native Infantry, one of the original defenders of the Lucknow Residency in 1857. He was actually somewhat unusual material for a Victorian VCO in that he was uncommonly well educated. He'd studied at the Canning College, Lucknow, and could read and write English, Persian, and Nagri Hindustani. Due to his father's eminence as one of the select band of Beli Guard Bahadurs, he received a direct commission as a Jemedar in 1875 at the age of 20. Within 10 years, he was appointed Subedar Major of his regiment, having already been awarded the OBI for his services in Egypt 1882. Now here we see a painting of him by the artist Chetapal Cheta. Cheta has used him as a model for a Subedar of the 16th Bengal Infantry and painted his uniform as such. Gurdat Singh died of disease on the island of Wei Hai Wei while returning from the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. His place was then taken in the regiment by his nephew Jaikaran Singh, who also received a direct commission into the army in 1910. This interesting image shows a typical old Indian Army custom. The Subedar is Subedar Major Mansoor Khan of the 55th Corks Rifles Frontier Force. Taken on the occasion of the first regimental reunion in 1927, he wears his own medals on the left and his father's medals on the right side of his chest. In this manner, the symbols of honour transcended generations and cementing loyalties amongst families and social groups on one hand, and the Paltan or regiment and the Sarkar on the other. The subject of this photograph is Subedar Major and Honorary Captain Man Singh. He came from a distinguished line of soldiers, and the family's record of military service amply illustrates how effective the honours system was in ranking and rewarding the disparate elements of the Indian Army and in reconciling their position within the colonial hierarchy. A Chima Jat Sikh from Gujranwala district, his ancestors had held responsible mansabs under the Lahore Darbar during the Sikh rule. His great-grandfather Sardar Hukum Singh was killed at Mudki, while Hukum Singh's younger brother Sardar Jagat Singh fell fighting the British at the Battle of Chilianwala. After the Punjab was annexed, the family took service in the British Indian Army and had 23 serving and retired members during the period 1860 to 1920, including 7 VCOs. Man Singh himself enlisted in the 29th Punjabis in 1890, was commissioned in 1906. In this photograph taken circa 1938, when he was an honorary magistrate and vice president of the Gujranwala District Soldiers Board, he wears an impressive string of decorations, starting with the IGS 1854 with clasp Samana 1891 and ending with George V's Silver Jubilee Medal of 1935. For distinguished war services, he was mentioned in dispatches and awarded the Military Cross, an OBI, made an honorary captain, and granted a Jagir. Man Singh's son was to serve in the first 11 Sikhs in Burma in World War II, while his grandson retired as an Air Commodore from the Indian Air Force. Now, although instituted by Queen Victoria in 1856, Indian soldiers were not eligible for the award of the Victoria Cross till King George V announced during the Delhi Darbar in 1911 that henceforth Indian soldiers could also be awarded Britain's Supreme Award for Valour. The first Indian VC was won by Sepoy Khudadad Khan of the 129th Baluchis at Hollebeek in Belgium in October 1914. Indian soldiers were therefore thereafter to go on to win a total of 40 VCs before Indian independence in 1947. Here we see Jemedar Mir Dast of the 55th Corps Rifles and Afridi from Tira on the northwest frontier province. He became the first Indian officer to win the VC for most conspicuous bravery and great ability during the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium on 26 April 1915. This was the occasion when the Germans had used poison gas for the first time during the war. Now, before embarking for France, he had told his colonel that he would not return without the Victoria Cross. He said, now that Indians may compete for this greatest of all Bahaduris, he had said, I shall return with it or remain on the field. Now, while undoubtedly a brave soldier, and he'd previously been awarded the IOM for gallantry during the Momant campaign in 1908, his case for award of the VC was definitely helped by the actions of his brother, Jemedar Mir Mast, of the same regiment, who deserted to the Germans along with 14 other Afridi sepoys of his company, declaring that he would not fight in the army of a country that had declared war against the Khalifa of Turkey. Mir Mast was dined and feted by the Germans in a major propaganda blitz, aimed no doubt at the British Indian Army's considerable Muslim soldiery. Mir Dast was presented with his VC by no less than His Majesty the King to match the reception granted to his brother by the Kaiser. Now, the subject of this photograph is Lance Dafedar Pyara Singh of Central India Horse, a Jat Sikh of village Lalton Khurd in the Ludhiana district of the Punjab. The village had a strong tradition of military service and was one of those that were presented with a special commemorative tablet for its outstanding contribution in men during the Great War. Pyara Singh's claim to fame is, however, of a different kind. He belonged to B Squadron Central India Horse, which had refused to board a troop ship bound for North Africa in 1940, stating that they would fight for the defense of India, but not in an imperial war beyond its borders. 108 men were court-martialed, 4 were executed, and 100 sentenced to transportation. Pyara Singh was sentenced to transportation for life, as he was an NCO and hence a relatively senior soldier. As a mutineer, he received no pension or medals from the army, although he was released from imprisonment after independence. Here, he wears his father's and uncle's medals, showing service on the Northwest frontier in 1897 and the Great War, all mounted together in a row. The incongruity of wearing British medals did not strike him when he posed for this photograph in 1979. They were his father's tamgas and tokens of honor, and as his father's son, he was entitled to wear them. Now, here we see an old Sikh mutiny veteran from 1905. He wears his old military tunic and his campaign medals for service in the 1857 uprising, the Second Afghan War of 1880, and he's accompanied by a young boy who would have grown to adulthood, seeing the paint begin to peel off the gilded edifice of imperial solidarity. The intricately constructed image of imperial homogeneity, reinforced and exemplified by its system of honors and awards, succeeded only too well. It is only when the subject races, as represented by the favored classes of the Indian Army, began to test the validity of that imagery that they discovered that the illusion of solidarity was literally only skin deep. The image that ultimately comfortably endured and was fitfully propagated to the end was that of a relationship based on the Mai Baap Sarkar, or a benign paternal government. It was, after all, a colonial polity with deep racial prejudice, and could have existed in no other manner. Thank you.